playing just by ear. All right, ready in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Franklin Pierce University Academic Showcase Roundtable, Can Poetry Matter? This roundtable features Franklin Pierce students, English majors all, who were students in last year's American Poetry Seminar course offered here at the university. The panelists are, from my left, Caitlin Mulcahy, Bridget Claft, Troy Nikander, and Melissa Stewart. The question that gives the title to this roundtable, Can Poetry Matter?, was first asked by a poet and critic named Dana Gioia in a now famous essay published just a little over 25 years ago. In this essay, Gioia contended that poetry had become the province of a subculture, based primarily in academia, so that is in universities and colleges. Furthermore, that it had lost its place in the reading habits of the generally educated public. And that the greatest loss, that it had lost much of its relevance to us and to our world. Now, quite a few things have happened to revitalize the poetry scene since Gioia wrote that essay. And in fact, some of them have been the result of the gadfly stance that he adopted. Slam poetry has had a tremendous rise in popularity and other spoken word art forms. The Poetry Foundation, once a staid kind of affair, has been energized by the infusion of lots of money from big donors, and they've started sponsoring poetry writing and reading in a whole range of venues. Garrison Keillor, until very recently, used to read a poem every night on National Public Radio, something that really got poetry into the American ear. There have been celebrations. National Poetry Day is now a big deal, and contests, including a fairly recent one in poetry recitation that students in a previous version of this course entered and sort of strut their stuff in. Still, the question, can poetry matter, haunts us. Who really reads this stuff outside of these kind of structured occasions and outside of the classroom? And with texts and with music downloads and with video streaming, kind of the coin of the realm in social communication, what importance is it that there be artfully crafted written words? Can poetry matter? Can it be made to matter? These are the questions that the students are going to be delivering their own answers to based on work that they've done for the course, which they'll be presenting in kind of abbreviated form, poems that are relevant to that work, and interaction among themselves and hopefully with the studio audience. So, enough pontificating by the professor. I think let's turn it over to the students, beginning with Katie Mulcahy, whose study involved the place or the value, really, of poetry in school education.
So to start off, I think most of us had our first experience with poetry in our classrooms, either in early elementary or even further education in high school and hopefully in college as well. So I wanted to just start off saying, whilst most English classes cover a brief unit on poetry and the schematics of poetry, some of the great American poets are often glossed over in favor of the more popular, such as Poe and Frost. Poets such as Anne Bradstreet and Ralph Waldo Emerson, which I'm going to cover today, are some of the greatest American poets, and they've often opened the doors to many students and introduced us to the real academic look on poetry. So these poets often take themes that are thought to be dead to high school students, and they bring them alive. And I'd like to answer the question with can poetry matter, in saying that I think to make poetry matter to the student, we really have to connect it to their lives. So for students, we really need to look at these really broad themes such as love and, loss and mourning and sadness, and connect them to the students' lives, and that these are still things that everyone goes through today, so that students can look at that and say, maybe I'm not so different from someone like Bradstreet or Emerson. So to begin with, I had an instructional plan where the students would be looking at first the biographies of Bradstreet and Emerson, going in chronological order. So we'd begin with Bradstreet and talk about her background, and then study in depth some of her poems. Today I'll be reading from To My Dear and Loving Husband by Anne Bradstreet. To my dear and loving husband, if ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye woman, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the east doth hold. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we live in love let's so persever, that when we live no more we may live ever. So this poem, I think, is something that students can really look at and see that it's still alive. People still write love poetry to their loved ones, whether it be romantic or familial love or just a love of a friend. We still have that deep love that I think we can all connect to in Bradstreet's poem. And I think that's a way for students to see that poetry is alive and it's something that they can connect to their own lives. So then after Bradstreet, I would move on to Emerson, and I would be talking about just his background and how his poetry is still really sought after by academics to study and is really valued by American society, and I'd like to think internationally as well. So today I'll be reading Concord Hymn by Ralph Waldo Emerson. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps. In time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone, that memory may their deed redeem, when like our sires our sons are gone. Spirit that made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them in thee. So this poem is really still looked upon today, just as it deals with the monument that is in Concord, Massachusetts, and still stands today. And as we discussed, I think, during our practice, it's a good memorial for poetry itself, and that it still stands up today, this thing from long ago, and it will continue to stand, just like these ageless themes that I've touched upon in Bradstreet and Emerson's poetry. So that's why I think poetry matters still.
Katie, I wanted to ask you, for teaching, how important do you think historical background is?
I think it's extremely important, honestly. I think it's really helpful in understanding where this is all coming from for the person. Like, as Bridget will touch upon later, to have someone with such an interesting background, I think you need to understand that to see where either their endless love, like Bradstreet, is coming from, or their sorrow and their, all that really dark material is coming from. I think it's really important that students can at least glimpse the background. That, and I think it can really help you connect with these people, or at least find interest in them. For example, my favorite poet, his poetry, I love it, but it was his background that really drew me in. So I think that you really need to have both things to really understand both the author and the poetry itself.
I agree.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you, Katie. I think it's so important to know where the poem is coming from. I think poetry is so deeply personal that even if it is not a topic that people may seem as personal, maybe it's political, maybe it's just about the world in general, state of affairs, who knows what. It's still an opinion from that person, and it's a deeply personal piece that they do, and I think it's so important to know where they came from with that. If no one has anyone else to ask Katie, do you have a question?
So I noticed that the two poems that you picked were, they sounded like pretty traditional in the sense that they had like a pretty steady rhyme meter. Do you think that choosing that type of poetry instead of like a more modern poet would be more successful, like Bradstreet and Emerson being replacements for Frost and who was the other Poe that you said?
I think it's a good introduction. I think to really appreciate poetry, and I think I thought about it briefly, and we were talking later. Melissa's poet is a very modern poet, and I think that these very modern poets where they don't have such a structure that these poems have, I think it's really a good gateway for students, that if you were to see them with a book of modern poetry, it's a great way to introduce them to new poetry. And then I think once they can appreciate the beauty that is these modern poems, I think it allows them to further appreciate the beauty that comes with all the strict rhyme and meter and all of that goes into Bradstreet and Emerson's poetry, and even Poe and Frost. But I wanted to focus on the poets less, talked about in a traditional learning environment. So.
Do you think there'd be any trouble with just the language, say, in Bradstreet? Is there almost a kind of translation you would want to be doing with the students to make sure they understand the terms and some of the sort of unusual syntax?
I think you would definitely want to work slowly, maybe with Bradstreet's poem. I think, for example, Conquered Hymn, I think is fairly accessible for students, but Bradstreet, you might want to take one of her first poems and then go over it slowly, and that way the students can get comfortable with it, and then they can even branch off into groups and just kind of digest it themselves and go over it. I think ideally these poems in my own classroom would be in chronological order so that the students would already have been working with Shakespeare, for example, and like other poets that they would have been covering earlier poetry, and then we'd slowly be working our way so that they would have that basis of knowledge where they can see the language evolving as well. But that would just be an ideal situation.
Well, now I think we can move to a more modern poet, but one who wrote in traditional verse forms, and yet with a distinctly modern voice, and that's
Yes.
Edna St. Vincent Millay. So, Bridget?
So my poet, as he just said, is Edna St. Vincent Millay, and she was a poet. She was born in the late 1800s. She lived through, some very turbulent times, turn of the century, World War I, Roaring '20s, Great Depression, World War II. So there was a lot going on in her lifetime, and her lifestyle and her poetry really reflects that. And as modern readers read her work, I think that it's something that we can kind of understand because we're living in pretty crazy times ourselves. And I think that that's something that we can definitely see within her writing, and we can understand. And like we were talking, understanding the concepts behind the poem and behind the author of the poetry is so important, and being able to relate to them and understand where they're coming from with their poetry. And Edna St. Vincent Millay she was a little bit of a wild card in her time. She lived very fast and loose with the rules, and she was really a child at the times. She just did whatever she wanted to do. She took whatever lover she wanted. She went to Paris and stayed there for a year if she decided she wanted to go to Paris for a year, and no one could tell her what to do. And again, her poetry really kind of reflects that. And a lot of the subject matter that she talks about it's very, very personal stuff to her. And in fact, some of her more personal stuff never even got published. So to imagine her personal things that were published and then imagine something even more personal really speaks to how deep poetry can affect a person, which is one of the reasons I think it's so important to kind of bring back into the mainstream and accept that it is something that human beings do, that we write these poems. And a lot of us, can I get a show of hands, how many people in here have written at least one poem in their life and never shown it to anyone? That's a good majority of the room. That's a lot of people. So why do we do that? And it's like, it's this public-private life dichotomy, I think, and we don't want to share that with the world because poetry really unhinges our soul. It really kind of gets into who you are as a person. It's raw, it's emotional, and Edna St. Vincent Millay did not shy away from that. So today I'll be reading, the excerpt I'll be reading is called Rendezvous, and it is written, as we said, it's written in very standard format. It's in a sonnet format, but the writing style of it is quite modern, and I think you'll see why as I read it. So, Rendezvous. Not for those lovely blooms that prank your chambers did I come, indeed. I could have loved you better in the dark. That is to say, in rooms less bright with roses, rooms more casual, less aware of history in the wings about to enter with benevolent air. On ponderous tiptoe at the cue proceed. Not that I like the ashtrays overcrowded and the place in a mess, or the monastic cubicle too unctuously austere and stark, but partly that these formal garlands for our 8th Street Aphrodite are a bit too Greek, and partly that to make the poor walls rich with our unaided loveliness would have been more chic. Yet here I am, having told you of my quarrel with the taxi driver over a line of Milton, and you laugh, and you are you, none other. Your laugh pelts my skin with small, delicious blows, but I am perverse. I wish you had not scrubbed, with pumice, I suppose, the tobacco stains from your beautiful fingers, and I wish I did not feel like your mother.
Maybe you could explain that last line, Bridget.
Yeah. It kind of hits you right out of left field if you don't know the context, why is it so important to understand where these things come from. The lover that Edna St. Vincent Millay was writing to in that piece was about half her age. So she was in her mid to late 30s when she wrote that poem, and her lover was only just in his early 20s. So he was quite a bit younger than her, and they met when his name was George Dillon. They met when he was about 18. I believe they met in Las Vegas, which just gives you a context for their whole kind of turbid love affair, really. And she didn't care. Everyone knew about it, and she just kind of kept going. She never let anyone stop her. But we can see that she still has qualms with it, because she was living in a time when it wasn't acceptable to be that kind of person, and even today it's really not. Do you have a question?
I don't know, just like what I took away from it is like it really seems like kind of like a really ambivalent kind of romance. Like on one hand, like she has strong feelings about like when he laughs, it like feels good to her, but she doesn't like having to take care of him rather than being like more of a peer. It's like
So one of the things that I always found really fascinating about Edna St. Vincent Millay is that she's almost more in love with the idea of being in love than she's in love in the moment. And I think that's reflected in this poem as well, and especially because she's starting to get a little bit older as she's writing this poem. She's seeing more of life and how cruel it can be, and she's starting to kind of draw back into herself a little bit more. She realizes that maybe I don't love this person as much as I thought I did. Maybe I shouldn't have wasted so much time with him. He's so much younger than me. He's so much more naive than me. And I think that's reflected in her poem as well.
So I think the line where she's talking about how she argued with the cab driver over Milton is one of my favorite lines in poetry. And part of what makes Millay so fascinating for me is that she honestly predates like the confessional poets, like Plath and Adrienne Rich and Anne Sexton in the 60s and 70s. And that's still kind of the trend that we're in. You have poets that will write, for academe and for the high art of it, but many poets today strictly write autobiographical poems.
Yeah. And I think that she really kind of brought that to the forefront, and she showed the worth of those kind of poems, and you know, what they can mean to you as a person, and they can let you put out in the world, because it's, you know, she stuck around. She keeps popping back up, even though, you know, people will put her down, be like, oh, she just writes about her own life. She's not really writing anything all that extraordinary. But she keeps popping back up, so that's got to be something that we pay attention to. What about her makes it so that she keeps coming back up in our lives? Why does she captivate us so?
I think what's also interesting about her, this is now the third sonnet that I've actually heard or read by her, and I think it's really interesting that she has this, she's grappling with this idea of love that isn't that strictly traditional sense of love, but it's written in a very strict poetry form, and like even whenever you're reading, I can hear the rhyme scheme perfectly and everything. So I think it's really interesting that I think it goes into that thing you were talking about, that she is in love with the idea of love. I think she shows that in her form, but then the content, kind of like her actual relationships, not the content that she was expecting. So I really like how that's reflected in her poetry.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's jump to the present moment, to a contemporary poet who is a favorite of Troy's.
So, for my focus in American poetry, I talked a lot about contemporary work, and for the sake of discussion, a contemporary poet is somebody who's published in the year 2000 up to the present day, so about 18 years now. And Nick Flynn is one of my favorite contemporary poets. He's always been one of them since I started writing poetry about 4-ish years ago. And it was only when I got out more into the poetry world that I realized that nobody really knows who he is for the most part. I mean, if you're really into it, then you might know him, but he's really off the radar. But a poet like Rupi Kaur, who Melissa will be reading from, is one of the best-selling poets right now, but her poems are a bit different. They're not what you might call, like someone in academia might call a higher art or reaching the level of any of your classics. So that's the question I've been grappling with, is there value in writing for a general audience versus trying to win awards? I mean, can we place a value judgment on that? Because it's certainly intimidating when you have somebody who has an MFA from BU or Brown or any of your Ivy Leagues. You think, how am I supposed to do that? I'm just, a 20-something writing poetry and doing my best with it. And, again, how do we define worth? There's no one answer, I don't think. So, with that in mind, Nick Flynn was born in Scituate, Massachusetts in 1960. His father was homeless in Boston for a while, which is the topic of one of his memoirs. He's written a couple in his life. His first collection of poems, Some Ether, was released in 2000, and it won the Penn Joyce Osterweil Award, which is a very prestigious poetry award. But again, he's very much off the radar. He's not a poet that comes up a lot in popular discourse among poets or people that read poetry. His poetry focuses a lot on family, on the trauma from his childhood. His mother committed suicide when he was young, and so his most famous poem, Bag of Mice, relates to her suicide note. But he also deals with topics of religion as well, and trying to feel out his place in the world in terms of religion. So with that in mind, I'd like to read one of his poems called Emptying Town. I want to erase your footprints from my walls. Each pillow is thick with your reasons. Omens fill the sidewalk below my window. A woman in a party hat clinging to a tinfoil balloon. Shadows creep slowly across the tar. Someone yells, "Stop!" and I close my eyes. I can't watch as this town slowly empties, leaving me strung between bon voyages like so many clothes on a line, the white handkerchief stuck in my throat. You know the way Jesus rips open his shirt to show us his heart all flaming and thorny, the way he points to it. I'm afraid the way I'll miss you will be this obvious. I have a friend who everyone warns me is dangerous. He hides bloody images of Jesus around my house for me to find when I come home. Jesus behind the cupboard door. Jesus tucked into the mirror. He wants to save me, but we disagree from what? My version of hell is someone ripping open his shirt and saying, "Look what I did for you." Okay, are any questions on this topic? Ashley?
What's the background for the poem? Like, what point was he in? Like when was this published? Was this part of the original collection?
I believe so. The website that I pulled the text from said it was published in 2003, so I would assume that it was uploaded after the fact. Because he's had so much hardship in his life, he's had a lot of difficulty, navigating, faith and, kind of the, what did you do to deserve this? Where is my place in all of this? And I think in this poem that he's struggling with religion, like he feels that he owes a higher power something, but he doesn't quite know what to make of that.
So you said he was born in 1960s?
Yes.
And do you know if he wrote all of these poems in the contemporary era or if he wrote them throughout his life?
As far as I know, he didn't start seriously writing until about his 30s. He worked in a homeless shelter as a volunteer for a long time. He lived on a houseboat, but he spent a lot of time in the Boston area. So I think this is just a guess, but only once he kind of started to come to terms with these things did he write them down. Tyler?
So I feel like, this work shows like something that's like definitely written with a sort of more general audience in mind, but also is higher. I don't know what your conclusion was, but I was wondering how that, looking into Flynn's work, helped you address that question.
Yeah, I don't know, high art is such a weird term that I don't necessarily like, because I think poetry should be accessible for everybody. I kind of reject, your T.S. Eliot, Milton, because I feel like if you need a dictionary to understand half of the poem, maybe something's wrong. And I think that, Flynn, he has a lot of meaning buried in there, and you really have to read into his biography. But I was 18 when I first picked up his collection, and I felt like I could handle it. So I think, to try and answer your question, like, he does toe that line, and I think whether or not you do that depends on the poet. Jace?
How do you go about finding contemporary poets that you think are worth something? Because I feel like the way that I've been exposed to more contemporary poets through like Neon Vernacular and Native Guard was through classes. But how do you sift through contemporary poets and be like, yes, this one speaks to me, versus one that maybe doesn't?
Well, that's honestly hard to say for sure. Sometimes I'll talk to other poets that I know, either my classmates or my mentors that are faculty members. For anyone just casually interested in poetry, I always recommend anthologies are a good way to look at them. Professor Burns mentioned Garrison Keillor. He's collated a few collections of poems that he reads, so there's a lot of poems from a lot of different authors. So there's good poems for hard times. They're along that theme. And that's how I've discovered a lot of really good poets. And with the proliferation of the internet, too, you can even Google, like, contemporary poets, and you could probably find a ton of results.
I think Melissa is going to speak to availability on social media, contemporary social media. So why don't you take it, Melissa?
So for Can Poetry Matter, I wanted to address the question head on. I personally believe, and I think we all believe this, that poetry does, it has, and it will matter, and it will continue to matter. But why is what I wanted to look at, and how can we access it now? That was a great question by Jace. How can we make it accessible for people? I think what's great, and we've all addressed, is poetry's ability to convey universal human emotions, things we all can feel and interpret in our own experience. And I think about Katie's bringing it to a classroom. You're getting so many different perspectives and different experiences, and I think that that's really important. I think what's really revolutionized poetry is technology. We have access to tons of poets. I wouldn't know about Flynn, but now I can find a lot of his works online. There's tons of different things we can do, and I think this has provided artists, poets with outlets for their poetry that they wouldn't have had before. I know if you go on YouTube, Professor Burns talked about slam poetry. You will find so much slam poetry, and that means so much to people. There's even improvised poetry, which you would think is otherworldly, but it's a thing, and people love it, and it's out there. And I think that popularity is only growing with the different forms of technology that we have and the resources we have to put it out there. So Goya talks about, this is becoming a subculture. And I would argue that I think it's the mainstream. I think it's here. We see it in almost every facet of our lives. I think a work that really stood out for me was Claudia Rankine's Citizen, an American Lyric. And this addresses race in America and racial issues and issues of social justice. And what she does is she pairs art and she pairs prose poetry together to create this really amazing lyric, and it's expressive, and you feel the feelings of someone going through that because if you can't experience that. I think, and this I talked about a lot in my paper, and I think it's important, 2014's Milk and Honey by Ruby Coart was so popular. Everywhere you went online, you saw this, and what was so great about it was, while it's questioned and criticized for its value poetically of having, no line, meter, it's organized in a different way. I mean, if you look at Ezra Pound, for example, modernist poets, they're criticized for the same things. It's just change. People are reluctant to accept a change that they may not like. So Milk and Honey, I think, was so great because it was these small excerpts and poems with little images, and people loved it. People connected to it. And I think that's really where I saw, because I have always loved poetry, I think that's where I saw it really take off, and you see the elegance of just 3 lines, 2 lines, 4 lines, the elegance of language through that, and how beautiful our language and language is. And we saw that with Malay's poem and with, Flynn's poem, and I think that was really an important thing. And I'll be reading an untitled poem by Ruby Coart. You look like you smell of honey and no pain. Let me have a taste of that. I liked that one a lot because I think that there's so few lines but so much emotion in it. And I think that's the beauty of poetry now, and how we can get it out there. You can have it be what you'd like.
I really like what you said about modernist poetry, and how even back when they were more new, like they were receiving a lot of backlash for rejecting form and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think this really speaks to the point that Troy was trying to get to too, which is that I think a lot of the problem with art is that there's a lot of gatekeeping. There's a lot of people thinking this is what real art is. This is what needs to happen to be for it to be considered art. When the beauty of art is that it can be just about anything that conveys the human experience.
Yeah, I agree.
That was a really nice poem. I actually hadn't heard of Milk and Honey before, and it just really reminds me, because I personally watch a lot of comedians, and there's one who's actually written a book of poetry. His name is Bo Burnham. And I think it's just really interesting to see that there are so many ways to write poetry and see poetry. And so I guess my question really is, how do you differentiate between her poems? If I wanted to find this poem exactly, how would I find it since it's untitled? Would I have to buy the book?
I think you could just look up the first few lines. That's what I did. I had heard it before, and it drew me in, and I said, okay, you look like you smell of honey. Interesting. So then I found it through that. So I think because they're so short, some of those lines will resonate with you and come to you, but also buying the book is probably a nice thing if you like that kind of poetry. I think that's a good thing, and obviously Nick Flynn's book too.
I think, piggybacking off that real quick, I think the beauty of language of poetry is something that does make it very easy to remember. I did a showcase earlier where we talked about stanza, and I had the audience clap to the beat of Green Eggs and Ham, and so that they would understand the rhythm of it. And everyone knows Green Eggs and Ham, and I think that's something that really is impactful about poetry, is that it does have that kind of flow, and it's something that is easy to remember.
I do have another question for Katie, actually. I don't know if any of you have heard of Shel Silverstein. He's a very classic children's poet. And I guess what my question is would you consider putting that into your education of poetry?
I don't think it'd be a bad idea. I want to be a high school teacher, so I doubt we'd focus too much on it, but I think it's a great way to introduce people to poetry. I mean, I grew up on Shel Silverstein. I loved it. And I think most of us can have a Shel Silverstein poem running in the back of our minds right now. So I think it's a great way to introduce some of the basic schematics of poetry. I would probably start introducing that in the lower levels, and then maybe each year to start off the semester or quarter really be like, okay, do you guys remember this? Let's go over it. Hey, point out the rhymes, point out this. In that way you can kind of look at the most basic example and then build off of that. But I think it's fun too, so.
A couple back there.
Dr. D.
You're all in the English program, so poetry matters to you for some obvious reason. How can poetry matter to other students on campus? What avenues, outlets, activities, what are ways to make it matter to a population that may not be studying it, may not be drawn to it in the same ways that you are? Anyone, all?
Do you want to start with you, and then we can just go down the table?
You guys, I'm thinking.
All right, I'll start.
Okay.
So I think it's difficult. I mean, obviously with Sigma Tau Delta, we try to do some outreach with poetry, and one of the biggest things I've noticed that helps people access it is technology. If you go on WordPress, you could be reading poetry all day and still not be done. I mean, it's totally free. You can just write your work and put it out there, and people will read it. And it's gotten so different now because to submit to journals, you just have to press a button pretty much, and it's out there. And I think that's perhaps the biggest key to it, is even if you're not studying it academically, if you can find personal meaning in poems that you choose and that you like, that could help.
I can take a crack at that if you don't mind. Yeah. Okay. So when I had people raise their hands, that's what I immediately thought of. Was most of the room has written poetry at some point or another, and maybe this is a little bit of a bias sample because you are here at the poetry roundtable. But even so, I think it's probably a good show that a lot of people have written poetry in their lives, but a lot of times they'll get discouraged, or they won't feel as if they are being encouraged, or maybe they'll feel like it's not accessible to them. So I think coming from a formal education standpoint, and maybe Katie can jump on this if she so chooses, but I think it's important to incorporate it at a young age. If it's something that's part of kind of your learning experience as you're growing up, even in the home or maybe during preschool, if you have parents that aren't really poetically inclined, I suppose, it's gonna make more sense to you as you get older if you're already familiar with the language and the verse and the flow of poetry. If it's something that you're already comfortable with, it's going to be easier to address it in an academic setting.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. I also think that we really have to emphasize the fact that all this poetry is linked by a universal human experience. We're all feeling these same things, and I think it's really important that we all understand that we read a poem and we go, that's me, I feel that too. And I think that you should be able to take that and then go through and either say, I relate to this, I love it, it's me, or you should be able to sit there and go, I want to write my own. Even if it's not good, I just want to get these words on the page. I've sat there and just typed and been like, this is what I want to get out. And then you can kind of work it out afterwards and just say, like, it doesn't have to be for other people. I think people can appreciate poetry just to sit there and hold close to yourself. And I think that's just as powerful. And I think that, as Bridget was saying, we really have to work on that young with our children to foster that love of language first. And so that way they can sit there and say, I love the way these words sound together. I think it's fun to have things like Dr. Seuss and Shel Silverstein. And then you can fall in love with the words, and then you can fall in love with the way it looks in your head, and then you can look at the meaning, and all of it can just be related to you, and you can just make it your own thing.
I have a note on that too. It's actually a follow-on to what we're doing. In the course of putting this together, Richard Barnes from the Fitzwater Center said there's basically an unused Franklin Pierce television channel, and he's looking for content for it. So we put our heads together and we thought, what if we had like a poetry hour every week, and people could read either their own poetry or classic work, and it would get to be a regular thing. So it's not just a special event, National Poetry Day or whatever. I know for me, the Garrison Keillor, reading that one poem every night at the same time, I really began to look forward to it, and it was really kind of a life ring somehow in the day. And I think if we could establish that, we could give an outlet to people who write poetry and who like to read it, but also open it up to the broader community to connect with it in their own ways. So we're going to give that a try. Set up that a poetry feature on the FP. What did he call it? I can't remember what the name of the channel was, but stay tuned.
When will that be happening?
That'll start next year. Yeah.
I think, just to answer that, I've been thinking about it for a second. I think for students specifically, Troy was mentioning WordPress. I think to show that there's more poetry beyond. I know when we started looking at rhyme and meter, it was and all that. It's at first so frustrating. It can feel like a foreign language to you. I think showing that it's not just that, and you can build and love poetry in different ways, in different forms, and from different sources is important. So yeah, and there's with podcasts and radio stations, I know people listen to podcasts on their way home. If there's access to poetry ones here, even, that would be great. I think that's a really, really good idea to get people more involved.
Okay, well,
some more questions.
I was wondering how the panelists felt about Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016. There was a lot of debate about are music lyrics real poetry / literature. Just wanted to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, my paper actually talks about that, and I talk about that in length. And I think I analyzed a Kendrick Lamar song, and there was rhyme, there was meter, there was, it was set up in stanzas. So I think specifically with Bob Dylan reaching such a wide audience, I think that there's a lot of value in putting music to poetry, and I think music is a form of poetry.
And that's actually fitting because he just won the Pulitzer Prize for music. I think it's great. I think the biggest enemy of literature is limiting what its definition is, and there are so many artists and bands all throughout recording history, I think, that have crossed into that more literary territory, like with a lot of meaning and story in their lyrics, and I think we should be encouraging that rather than discouraging it.
I really love that. I really love that quote. The biggest enemy to poetry is limiting its definition. I love that.
Okay, well, I think if there are no further questions, no further thoughts from the panel, we really want to thank everyone for coming, being part of this lively studio audience. And again, stay tuned for more activity in the field of poetry on campus in time to come.
Good job, guys.
are
Brutal.
killer.
I know.